I want to kind of go back to where you talked about where you are and where you want to go. Hopefully you will see that the distance is quite great, in the sense that where you are today, if you think about what makes you successful today and what is going to make you successful when you're 10x, hopefully they're very different things, right? Really, these are different orbits, and the kinds of things that you need to be good at are different at these two levels. So whatever brought you here won't get you there. That is one of the sort of phrases that you have to kind of keep in mind. Because what happens here is, if you keep going the way you're going, you can achieve 1.2, 1.3, 1.5. But 10 requires a different kind of thinking and a different kind of even strategy, structure, operations, everything. All the 6 capitals that Arun talked about, they will all be different at the 10x level. But there is usually a feeling, and this is where, theory of constraints comes in, what we are going to talk about next. Usually there is one thing that holds back. Can you see that? Should be a bit larger. So first I will just talk about the theory for a couple of minutes. This comes to us from, how many of you have read this book called Goal? 1, 2, Goal. 3, 4, 5. If you haven't read it, read it.
Could you spell it out?
G-O-A, just like football, goal. Goal. Goal.
Goldratt's.
Eliyahu Goldratt, who is, interestingly enough, he is not a management theorist or anything, he is a physicist. And he has applied physics to management, then to businesses, basically. And his view is, he just passed away a few years ago. His point was that whatever system you look at will usually have one bottleneck, right? And the goal of anybody who wants to improve the throughput of the system is to work on that bottleneck. What is the point of working on other things, right? In a way, this is very contrary to what, say, TQM would say. Those of you who are familiar with the quality, movement and all that, TQM always used to say you should improve everywhere. It is good that you should improve everywhere, but the fact is, improving everywhere may not give you the big bang that you need. Because the one thing that is holding you back is the one thing that is holding you back, and you've got to work on that. So one of the important things that you have to do between now and there is to figure out what is the one thing that is going to prevent you from getting there. The one thing. It won't be 2 things or 3.5 things. It will be one thing. And you've got to figure out what that is. And the best part is, it doesn't require any research, no market research, no management consultant, nobody to tell you that. Because it will be very obvious to you once you sit and look at the 2 pictures, this and that. So the first task of 10x growth, once you figured out what 10x growth is to figure out the one thing that will prevent you from getting there. It will be one of the 6 capitals only, because that is all there is basically to building a business. But which of them is it, is what theory of constraints is about, or constraints is about. So typically a constraint could be an external constraint. Let us dismiss that right away, because I don't think any of us in this business are more than 50% of the market. If you are more than 50% of the market, then yes, maybe you got a problem. Like Steve Jobs Apple may have a problem. They've already sold an iPhone to everybody on the planet, right? Unless they discover life on Mars, it's going to be a little difficult, right? So they have a problem. Microsoft has a problem because they've already put Windows in everybody's machine. However much we hate it, we got Windows, right? So not much scope there. But market share is usually not a problem for most companies that I have worked with. I have yet to come across a company which has more than 1% market share of any market, because every market is huge, right? So let's dismiss that. If the constraint is not outside us, then where can the constraint be? If it's not outside, where can it be? Inside, right? Now that sounds bad. But actually, if you think about it, it's very good. Because what is the good thing about having an internal constraint? You can do something about it, right? If the constraint is outside you, what can you do? Nothing you can do but pray to God, right? But if the constraint is inside you, you can do something. It's just like, students complain that I studied very hard and I failed. That's a problem. But if you didn't study and you failed, that's good, because it means you can study next time, right? So it's like that. You can do something. If you can do something, it's good. Now, internal constraints again come in different kinds, and I just want to talk about that. There are three kinds of internal constraints. The first one is one that Arun already mentioned, which was called limiting beliefs. Limiting belief is the most dangerous and the most insidious of all constraints, because it is very powerful and you don't see it. It is invisible. It is deep rooted inside you. What are some examples of limiting beliefs that you may have? I have heard some of these already in the discussions today. For instance, now you want me to tell him that this is all wrong and we are going to do something different. It can't happen, right? And I've been brought up from the day one thinking that what he is doing is right. Because in fact what he is doing was right? In that situation or in that circumstance or at that time. But now if you want to do something different, how do you shake out of that? Is actually, for most people in this room, I would think the biggest constraint is how to get out of that limiting belief. But the first thing to get out, first requirement is you have to recognize it. If you don't recognize it, you can't break it, right? So first of all of you, all of us, including me, should sit back and say, what are the limiting beliefs that we have? That don't have any basis in reality, but they are based in the way we are brought up, in the way we think. For instance, many women in this room, one of the beliefs I've heard very often is that women cannot be any good at engineering and mathematics. This is ridiculous, right? It's a ridiculous belief, but it is a belief many people have. Girl cannot go into engineering. Why? Math karna padta hai. Math kya karegi? Forgetting that some of the greatest mathematicians ever were women. My own sister, who is like 1 year older than me, she is the greatest mathematician I have ever come across. She is 10 times as smart as I am. First female gold medalist at IIT Bombay. First person to crack 10 points. She is a woman. I was nowhere near her. And we are coming from the same family. So the idea that women can't be good at mathematics is absurd. But it is a belief that people have. Therefore, you start steering them into tum arts mein jao, do something other than engineering, right? Because what can a girl do anyway? So those kinds of things are limiting beliefs. They are partly imposed by us, but mainly they are internal. So that is number one. The second kind of belief is what I call policy constraints. Again, this is a word that Goldratt talks about too. And it's an important one to think about. A policy constraint is a constraint that you have invented in the organization for no good reason. You see this guy? Who is he? Bhishma. Bhishma is a very good example of policy constraint. Because if you look at him, he was a very great warrior. If he had fought up to his full capacity, the Pandavas would not have won the battle of Kurukshetra. Right? He was alone capable of defeating all of them. So what did he do? From day one, he started taking oath after oath. Right? First oath was Shadi nahi karunga. Brahmacharya ka oath. Why? Because my children also should not sit on the throne of Hastinapur. Right? Then he said, whoever sits on the throne of Hastinapur, I will support, however much of an idiot he may be. Correct? Which is the cause of the whole. So if you can trace back, the whole Mahabharata is caused by policy constraints that Bhishma took upon himself. And they were all stupid. But the reality is that they all bound him, and it changed the history of at least India at that point of time. Now, what are Actually, one can go on and on about, even when the war started, he started making rules of conduct, right? Rules of warfare were what? Do you remember? The first rule of warfare was Maharathi will fight only Maharathi. The Kauravas had an 11-7 advantage in fighters. When you have 11-7 advantage and you say one-on-one combat, what are you really saying? It means we are going to lose, right? So he was creating rules so that they could lose. He may have done it intentionally by that time. But these are all policy constraints. What's an example of a policy constraint? Let me just show you some in organizations. I've heard all these in some of my consulting work, so I have listed them up. First one is I will hire only people from IIT. IIT is a great place, I'm also from IIT. But the fact is, if you say this kind of thing, then how are you ever going to find the kind of people you need? Every project must earn 40% margin. Why? Because some formula is there in the company that if you don't earn 40% margin, who will pay for sales and marketing, who will pay for CEO salary, etc., etc. End of the day, you do not take some projects which you should take. Like I said, I would talk about it, so let me talk about it. One of the things that Goldratt says, which I think is very interesting again, is once you have identified the constraint, don't immediately go and get more of it. That is not the first thing you should do, because that's not efficient. The first thing you should do is, you should get the most out of what you already have. For instance, suppose you come up with the constraint that I don't have enough salespeople. Alright, that doesn't mean first thing you should do is go and hire more salespeople. What is the first thing you should do? Get the most out of the salespeople you got in the first place. Which means two things. One is, don't make them do other faltu jobs. Typically, what do salespeople do? They do all kinds of stuff which has nothing to do with sales. When the CEO arrives in the country, they have to go to the airport and pick him up. Why? Because anyway faltu mein pada hai, airport ja sakta hai. Right? Which is really what happens. But the reality is, if he is the constraint, you should not be doing other things. You should get as much out of him as possible. So don't use him for other things. The second rule that Goldratt proposes, which is again an interesting one, he says everybody in the organization should work at supporting this guy. The whole organization should orient itself to working on the constraint. So the sales guy is not able to do sales, the rest of the company should figure out how to help him do sales. So if someone sitting back here has to call up the customer and fix the appointment, do that.